So we're getting into probably our, I guess we could say, most challenging unit, and that's going to be because we're only talking about nervous system type stuff. So we're going to hit nervous system really hard. It's unavoidable. We're talking physiology, and the nervous system is the one doing a lot of that controlling and commanding for other organs, which means a lot of biochemical reactions, a lot of movement and action, right? And that's where the physiology comes in. So we're going to take it step by step, take your time, and really dive into the nervous system so that we can get through this one. But we're going to start by just talking about nervous tissue, kind of do an overview on just the different types of cells and then how they work, right, in terms of electrical output, electrical signaling, as well as chemical signaling. But overall, we're just going to talk about how the nervous system and endocrine systems are similar and different from each other, talk about the nervous system as a whole, in terms of key terms, functions, organization, and then we will eventually get into the autonomic and somatic divisions, talk about sympathetic versus parasympathetic and enteric when we're looking at the autonomic side, and then look at the sensory, integrative, and motor pathways as well. So if we think about the nervous system in general, right, it's going to be for command and control, right? It's going to connect our organ systems and limbs and skin and all that together. It's going to allow us to send and receive information, especially rapid information, both about the inside of our body as well as the environment around us. And it's going to regulate and help control certain activities that you don't want to have to think about on a regular basis, like your heartbeat and your breathing rate. So if we kind of remember and compare the nervous system and endocrine systems, remember these two are working together to kind of coordinate everything and kind of are the ones in charge of maintaining homeostasis. But again, you can compare and contrast them. I'm not going to take the time on this because these videos are going to be kind of long, but if you'd like to pause here and make this comparison, I welcome you to. But just keep in mind, nervous system tends to be fast, endocrine system tends to be slow. And so if we look at some terminology, we want to talk about some terms. Hopefully some of these at least sound familiar or you remember them from anatomy. But if not, you'll have to do some vocabulary checks. But let's go ahead and get through them. So central nervous system, we're talking brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, we're talking about everything else. So nerves, ganglia, nerve plexuses, right? And then we have different types of neurons. We have an interneuron. This is going to be a neuron we find only, like, entirely within the central nervous system. A sensory neuron, also called an afferent neuron, is going to transmit impulses from a receptor into the central nervous system. And a motor neuron, or an efferent neuron, is going to transmit impulses from the central nervous system out to an effector, right, to something that's going to cause an action. A nerve is going to be basically a collection of axons, like a long rope or cable of axons. They may be just sensory, they may be just motor, or they may be mixed, where they have both sensory and motor neurons inside of that nerve. So think like a nerve is just like a bundle. Like each axon is an individual thread, right? Like an individual string, and the nerve is like the entire yarn, right, of all those individual fibers woven together. We have different types of nerves, like somatic motor nerves. These are going to stimulate your skeletal muscles, and autonomic motor nerves are going to be for things like smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and glands. We also have ganglions or ganglia, if we're talking about more than one. These are going to be collections of the cell bodies when we find them outside of the central nervous system. Whereas a nucleus is the same thing, but we find it in the central nervous system. So you'll notice we have terms where we call it one thing when we're in the central nervous system, we call it something else when it's peripheral. So a nerve is peripheral nervous system, right? That collection of cables. A tract is very similar to that, but the tract is central nervous system. So nerve and tract are really similar, except the tract is central, the nerve is peripheral. Same thing with ganglion and nucleus. They're both collections of cell bodies, but the ganglion is peripheral, the nucleus is central. So just make sure you remember those, because we're going to see that a few times where there's terms that are separated, right? There's different terms for the same kind of thing, just different parts of the nervous system. So if we look at the main components, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. I just went over those, so I'm not going to spend much time here. And then we have sensory and motor components. So sensory are afferent. We think afferent, we're thinking moving towards, we're arriving, right? So we're sending information towards the central nervous system. Information arrives at the central nervous system. Whereas efferent, we think exit. Efferent moves us away from the central nervous system. We can also take that peripheral nervous system and divide it into two sides. We have the somatic and the autonomic nervous systems. Somatic is voluntary. This is what you're doing. You're using this system right now, when you're writing down notes or you're copying what I'm saying. Those would be somatic actions, right? That would be part of your somatic nervous system response. It's voluntary. Whereas autonomic, think autonomic sounds like automatic. So autonomic, this is involuntary. It's just going to happen. You don't need to think about it. And a lot of times you don't even notice that these changes happen. Sometimes you'll notice the changes, but a lot of times you won't. So if there's a small change that's made to help maintain your blood pressure, you don't even feel it. This is going to include motor and sensory neurons, and is going to talk to a lot of different tissues, a lot of different organs, right? So somatic is kind of the simpler one in terms of who's involved. It's like we have the nerves and we have skeletal muscle. Autonomic, we're looking at glands, blood vessels, organs, like all sorts of stuff. So here's how we can kind of divide it up. Then there's also that one branch that's the enteric division that's just going to focus on your gastrointestinal tract, just focusing on your digestive system. Now the autonomic system can also be split between sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? So this is going to be your fight or flight, which is sympathetic, or your rest and digest, your parasympathetic. We'll get into those more later, so we're just kind of introducing them for now. The enteric nervous system, this is going to be involved with all of the nerves, generally configured in what's called a plexus, so like a net. It's like almost like a maze of neurons and whatnot that are going around the GI tract, right? And so this is going to help with digestion. And so again, we have that division. Again, sensory, we think afferent, your signals are arriving to the central nervous system. Efferent are going to be motor divisions because the signals are exiting the central nervous system. So there's a few pieces to these pathways, right? All of these pieces are generally involved. We have the sensory aspects. These are going to detect all the changes both inside and outside your body. And we have various neurons that are in all of these different, like in the somatic, in the enteric, and the autonomic nervous systems to help bring information in. The integrative aspects is going to make sense of this information. Taking information in from multiple body parts or multiple receptors. Let's say you're talking about bringing in information in from your eyes, but also your ears, but also your skin. Kind of integrating all that information together to build the big picture of what's happening, what's going on, and then making a decision of what response is appropriate. This is going to be part of the central nervous system. So the integrative stuff is central nervous system, right? The interneurons specifically. And then the motor aspect is, okay, now that we've decided what to do, we need to command those body parts, right, that can make that action happen to do so. And so we can initiate an action using the motor neurons, right, to get a muscle, a gland, or whatever to respond. And so here's our different pathways. And so there's a couple ways we can go with this, but notice the direction, right? Notice the direction. Notice how we're going. It's a one-way road, right? Sensory brings information in, integrate sends information out. Motor are going to receive that and cause a change.